Welcome, I'm Jan Holland, and today we're going to talk about identifying and understanding the effects of trauma. And I'm delighted to welcome Joan Washington. Welcome.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
And before we start, I would just like to read out a little bit about Joan. Joan Washington is a specialist trainer and educator with over 23 years' experience working with individuals, families, and communities affected by migration and other trauma experiences. Joan is an experienced case manager of complex clients, including torture and trauma survivors and asylum seekers. This has included children, adolescents, and adults. She has extensive experience in delivering workshops about the effects of trauma. Joan's recent experience is doing research and training in the youth justice space in terms of understanding the impact of trauma in adolescence and working with building resilience. So Joan, just to start with, I know that after the death of a loved one, divorce is considered the next major life stressor. And the experience itself can be traumatic, or that experience can trigger past traumas and unhealed childhood wounds. So would you like to speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so like it's quite a complicated area, but if you look at trauma itself, and what heals us and how we're impacted by trauma, our attachments are significantly important in how we sort of move through our lives. We're social creatures, we're social beings, and from birth we're pre-programmed to basically, I guess, think about how we like the bonding that occurs. It's essential within the life cycle in order to survive. So the baby is completely and utterly dependent, unlike any other kind of small newborn creature. And so we literally have to bond with our parent or caregiver in order to be able to survive, because if we don't, we won't get cared for, basically. And so attachment right from the beginning is really, really important, and it's also how we heal. But as we move through our lives, our attachments change and develop and move beyond the initial family group and into sort of other members as we sort of grow and develop and move through and form our own families. But those attachments are still significantly important no matter what part of the life cycle. They just sometimes change and as we develop. So if you think about the relationship between a couple, then that sort of disintegration of that attachment, therefore, can become quite significant from an individual's point of view. But also, too, when we think about that attachment, if a person has experienced early childhood trauma that's been interpersonal, then it can trigger old experiences to come back like they're present and right now in the moment. So if we've experienced a traumatic event from somebody in childhood, for example, who was meant to love and care for us, but didn't, or did it intermittently, what that can then do is bring back all those old feelings and emotions and connections and distress from that particular period and intensify that current experience for an individual. So it becomes much worse and much more significant for those people. And so it is really quite significant because trauma changes how we see and view the world. It means quite a lot in regards to how we feel safe in the world, how we have and deal with our relationships, and those bonds and connections are mapped out. The map of that begins, oh, I'm sorry, my dog's barking. That begins in childhood, that mapping of that relationship. So those early experiences can often affect how we react and how we respond back in later life, when we have another event that becomes quite impactful to us. So given that we have this huge need for attachment, when they are, broken, it is a very, very significant event, and it can make us feel quite unsafe. And at the heart of trauma is needing a sense of safety and connection and relationship. But because when we're triggered by an event, we can experience none of those things. We don't feel safe anymore. The breakdown of a relationship can destroy our sense of feeling safe in the world. And when we are in a state of being triggered by that fear and that lack of safety, then of course our ability to connect with other human beings is compromised, and we can't necessarily always feel that connection. Even if there are people around us that love and care for us, we don't always feel it because our brain literally isn't functioning the way that it is meant to, because we don't feel safe. And safety isn't just about physical safety. I mean, when we prepare for, like a life with somebody else, we're thinking about things like how we like what that's going to look like. We have children, we build a home together, and we build experiences together, and we move through our lives, and then suddenly all that's gone. So we end up in almost a grieving state as well. And if on top of that you have early childhood experiences that have been interpersonal, then that can be intensified by that experience. And we don't really always understand what's happening. If the relationship itself too was a traumatic relationship, say domestic violence, as an example, you've got issues around things that, where trauma bonding might have occurred through that relationship. And that's, this process of the person who is meant to love and care for us and who we love and care for is also our abuser. And it's a cyclic type of event that takes place throughout the relationship, where it goes through from abusing to love bombing which is a confusing sort of event, and it just cycles around and around. So you're moving through all these different states, and you end up with this strange kind of bond with your abuser, which is also one of the reasons it often takes individuals who are the victims of this type of abuse a long time maybe to get out of those types of relationships, because of that bond that develops. And so there's all sorts of aspects around this that make it really difficult for people to be able to cope and manage, because of the intensity of the events, and also too because we're grieving the loss of something that we went into with a sense of this is the future for us, and you do grieve the end of that. And if it's traumatic on top of it, the grief might be, instead of a normal grief, a form of traumatic grief. The thing about trauma is that makes it so difficult is that it's very hard to manage, because some of the key factors of trauma is avoidance, numbing, and like this lack of sense of safety, and also this intrusive thought process that we have, where like we might have things that sort of intrude upon our lives, like unable to stop our brain from thinking and managing, and shut down, and sleep, and nightmares, and all those sorts of things. But the avoidance, trying to avoid anything that reminds us or connects us or thinks about that traumatic event. And then for some people, the need to numb ourselves so that we're not in that position. Because when we are traumatized and then we experience triggers, our body goes into a state of reaction all of the time, where our nervous system is constantly engaged, and that's quite exhausting when you're always in that state.
Yes.
So it's complicated, but trauma sort of fits into this genre quite significantly, I think.
Yes, for sure. And also, one of the things in what you were talking about is often people have unhealthy coping mechanisms. There are good coping mechanisms and bad coping mechanisms, and trauma will often bring up our poor coping mechanisms. So would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I guess that's somewhat part of the like when we experience events in our lives, we come up with ways to manage and to cope with that in those events, and that can look different for different people. So it might be you become a workaholic, or it might be that you start to reach for a bottle of alcohol because it's numbing, or some people use other substances. Some people gamble. So and it's a way of being able to forget and disconnect from the reality that might be our life. And but they are coping strategies, and so it's not to say we shouldn't have coping strategies, but sometimes those strategies take over and they become what we call maladaptive. So they're no longer helpful because they've actually taken over our lives, and that becomes the driver. But it also prevents us from being able to manage other things that take place and come up, and we keep going back to these mechanisms that are negative. It's like, for some people, becoming very angry is a coping strategy. And putting our heads in the sand, isolating ourselves is a huge one, and I'd say that's a fairly common one in the divorce state, because, you have the splitting of friends and family, people that were in your life jointly, and then suddenly you're not seeing these people anymore. But also, too, for some people, there's a sense of shame or embarrassment around what they've gone through and what they've experienced. So they become to isolate themselves as well and withdraw from people around them because they don't want to talk about what happened, and they're trying to avoid having to talk about what happened, because a lot of people, when bad things happen, they want to know, oh, tell me about it, talk about it. And some people are just not ready to talk about it. And that's okay too. And it is because, as long as it doesn't become the driver of your life, where that becomes all encompassing. So there's different sorts of ways we use coping mechanisms. It can be, if it's short term and temporary, I don't think that there's anything wrong with a coping mechanism, as long as it doesn't become the driver for your life and becomes so damaging and maladaptive that it affects and impacts everything in terms of you being able to function normally.
Right, thank you. And also, before you mentioned trauma bonding, and I thought it's probably a good idea to talk about that. I believe that certain chemicals are released in our brain, but also emotions are driving factors as well. So would you just like to explain what trauma bonding is?
Well, so basically, you have a relationship, and say in a domestic, it's very common in domestic violence relationships, but you see it in childhood abuse as well, with say if it's a parent causing the abuse, but in a domestic violence one, same sort of thing. And so this person starts off in a sort of a love bombing phase, or or a grooming, I guess, stage. And so you're gaslit, I guess, into this idea. And if you gaslighting, it's an old word. It actually comes from a very old black and white movie, and it's about working with like you basically someone is saying to you, you're the problem, you're the and basically making you believe that there's something wrong with you. And creating a narrative for yourself, so that then you embed that into your own thinking, that it's me, I'm the problem. And the movie that it's from was like an old black and white movie, and it was about a man trying to make his wife believe she was mad. And it was by lighting the the old lights in the house that were run by gas and everything, and making her believe she was seeing things, and trying to create something, or a thinking that she was the problem and that she was mad. And so that's a really common tactic that's used in these sorts of relationships, where you create a sort of a narrative. You start with the love bombing, you start with those elements, and then when the person becomes or reaches a certain level of dependence, or because when we bond with someone strongly, we release a hormone called oxytocin, which is the love hormone. And men and women both have oxytocin. And so that's the love hormone, and that's the bond we release as, say, as a mother when we give birth too, and we're breastfeeding a child. We have that strong sense of a bond and connection and love is felt through this hormone. And so that is also released as we proceed through lives and form other bonds. And so, that process of experiencing that, then what happens is that we experience strong feelings towards that individual, and then it can go bad. And then the person starts that cycle of abuse where they move through, and they can be abusive in different ways. It can be that form of gaslighting, psychological, emotional, financial abuse, physical abuse, all sorts of abuse. And so, but they're all destructive, and for some people might not experience physical abuse, but strong levels of psychological abuse, and it's all very damaging. Ultimately, then, when that sort of that ends in that minute, then the love bombing begins again, the honeymoon period. And so it creates a level of confusion and back and forth within the individual, and you're gaslighted to believe, well, I wouldn't have hit you if you hadn't have done this. You did this, and therefore I had to hit you. If you hadn't have pushed me, and then, as all of this goes on, and the longer it goes on, that trauma bond continues to be created, exist, and sort of develop and build, and making it extremely difficult for a person to extricate themselves from those types of relationships, because they become very dependent on that individual. And there's no confidence at the end in that, for that individual, that they can ever go it alone, that they can do it by themselves, that they can ever manage, because there's so much that they've been built to believe that is wrong with them, and none of that is actually true. It's just this process of grooming that takes place all the way through. We think about grooming in terms of childhood abuse, but grooming actually exists at all levels, when you have that really strong interpersonal abuser.
Yes, thank you. And the interesting thing about gaslighting, which I think is important for people to understand, is that when someone denies your reality, it is madness making.
Yeah. You don't really believe that, you question everything, you question every element about yourself and what you believe, and, that you're the problem and that you're not okay. And, and it's a difficult thing I think sometimes a bruise is going to heal actually harder, a lot shorter than that experience of that constant mental barrage, and then changing your belief system, and in regards to who you think you are, the person you were prior to that relationship, and then the person that is left within that relationship, and then the end of the relationship. So it's an extraordinary thing when women can, and I say women because they are predominantly the victims of this type of abuse. Not to say that men don't experience it, but women are it's very gendered. But I think it's phenomenal when women can actually break away, and it shows, even if they don't feel like that they are that they have this level of strength. It shows a level of strength within them when they are able to do that. Because it is so terrifying, when you've been led to believe that you are this person now,
Yes. No, that's great. Thank you. So really, in all of this, I guess we need to know, how can one heal this trauma?
I think the biggest thing about healing in trauma is, there's certain principles. So there's the principle of, I'm just going to apologize if you can hear a whole lot of noise down there. It's my dog.
Not a problem.
So there's some principles. So the overarching principle is safety. We need to feel safe. Everybody feels safe, and we can operate effectively if we feel safe. We can think clearly, and we can't think clearly when we feel unsafe. We don't, our memory is impaired, our logical, rational sense of, what's going on around us is impaired. We're in our emotional brains. We're thinking at that level, very emotionally rather than rationally. So the need for safety is imperative. We need to feel safe, but safety isn't just our physical safety, it's our mental, emotional, social, cultural, all of those sorts of things. When we feel safe, we can function, we can learn, we can develop, we can think, we can remember, all of those things work. But when we don't feel safe and we're triggered, those things don't happen for us. And so that's why we tend to sort of operate up here a lot of the time when we're in that state. And so safety is the key. The biggest healer in relationships is safe relationships, safe connections. But if we're up and we're not feeling safe, our ability to connect with other people or feel that connection is actually impaired. So I can have 10 people saying to me how much they care and love and want to be there for me. But if I am highly triggered and in a really up or down state, then I can't feel that connection. I can hear the words, I just don't feel it and believe it in here. And that's because that part of the brain also sits in the same area that our reasoning, logical, rational thinking sits, and it's sort of impaired and sort of almost switched off during those times when we're really highly distressed. And so those are the big things that we really need. But to get there, I think it's important that when we're supporting anybody, is that we all have our own journeys and we're all unique. And so what works for me is not going to work for everybody else and vice versa. And so if you're getting support from people, it's important that we think about three things, and that is choice, collaboration, and control. So often, if we feel like we have control, we feel safe. If we don't have any control, we don't feel safe. And it's very hard for that acceptance or that sense of, there's some things that we simply don't have control over, and sometimes we have to learn how to accept that for ourselves. When I work with people, for me, it's about I am there to support that person in their journey, but they know themselves best. They are the experts in themselves. Anyone I say that is wanting to sit down with a therapist, I say, interview your therapist, make sure that they are the right person for you, that you connect with them, because without that connection, there is nothing. Yes. Go and sometimes if you're not sure how to start off, go with a list, go with your questions or the things that you want that from that therapist, and then everything else can build from there. So you say, I can't sleep, I feel angry all the time, I want support around that. That's where you can start. A good therapist, when you've experienced trauma, understands or will understand that they cannot push the trauma story until that's where the choice and collaboration comes into play. You need to have that relationship strong enough with them to be able to have those conversations, and you need to be ready for that conversation, because as you start to bring up stuff that is traumatic, your therapist needs to be able to support you to soothe. So that's one thing I always think, interview and make sure that that person is right for you, because sometimes they are not, and that's okay. You just go out and find another one. So if you've had a really extensive history of trauma, I usually advise people to ask their therapist one simple question is, do you understand the three-phased approach to working with trauma? And if they don't, then they're probably not really going to be that helpful for you, because the narrative is always sometimes that might have to wait. So that's why I say go in with what's initially thinking or sitting at the front of your mind that you want help with, and say, this is where I want to start.
Right.
There's other things though. We need that connection and that relationship, but we need different things from different people. And sometimes we end up going to the one person and we bombard them and we wear them out. Because it's tiring. And if people have had similar histories to you, they might get traumatized by your stories, because we can get secondhand trauma from others. So we don't want to wear our supporters out, because we need them. And people do genuinely want to help. They just often don't know how to help.
Yes.
So or they're scared that they're doing the wrong thing. So I, one of the things when I used to go out remotely and do was I used to say, all right, we've got the hand. There's not a lot of services out here. So I want you to think about the sorts of things that when you're upset, what do you need? Okay, you need somebody, sometimes you just need a hug, physical connection. You need that burst of oxytocin, the love hormone. And through touch, we get it. And so sometimes you just need the hug. Who's that person for you? Who's the person that if you went up to them and say, I need that from you, that they will just grant that? A 30-second hug is lovely because it really, you get a lot of oxytocin through that. Who's that person? All right, let's go talk to them and say, okay, well, the way you can support me is if I come to you and I say, I need this, and you just give it, no questions, Yep, okay, that's fine. Let's go to the second thing. Sometimes you need someone to help you problem solve because you can't do it for yourself because you're not thinking clearly. Who can that be? Who's your problem solving person in your life? We do the same sort of process. We talk to that person, we have that conversation. All right, what about when sometimes you don't want to talk, you don't want to have a conversation, you just want someone just to sit and be with you, but no communication is necessary. Who would that person be? Sometimes you just need someone to vent with, so we need different things, but those are all connection seeking types of activities that sometimes really are very, very healing. Regardless of whether it's trauma, it's always healing, those really straight, beautiful connections that we have, because we do need different things at different times. And once we start to recognize that, the other thing I think is starting to work on, we can become highly disconnected between brain and body through traumatic events. And so sometimes when we are triggered or when we're really upset, it's our body that experiences it first. Our heart starts racing, our body tenses up. We might break out in a sweat, our breathing becomes more shallow. And sometimes we really don't realize that because we've become so disconnected from our own bodies and that the two are just not talking. And so starting to work with people around going, okay, it's time to reconnect with my body so that I can be aware of these sorts of things that help me. And know that I'm starting to get upset and I can actually do something to help soothe me. And that doesn't always mean talk. It can be something that you just really connect with and love, and that allows you to switch off and take a break from the drama. Because sometimes that's all we need, just breathing space. The drama happens. We have to be able to grieve the loss that we've experienced because that's how we process things. So we have to feel it. But we also need breathing space from that. And those sorts of activities that we really connect with, sometimes we need to force ourselves back into them because, like I've noticed over the years, sometimes when you're really upset, you draw away from those things that give you comfort. But it's really sort of you can't, you can't do that. So, there's a whole lot of different strategies that I sort of encourage people to engage with, but they usually center around what works for that individual, what's going to help that person, and it's based on who they are, what they love. Sometimes, there's a lot of talk about mindfulness, and mindfulness is great, but you can connect mindfulness to any activity that you do that you enjoy and that you're already connected with. There's no point doing a mindfulness activity when it's not something that you would normally do in your own life. So there's lots of different types of activities. The other thing that's interesting around our thinking is that when we have had our thinking changed through the process of gaslighting or other events, or just where our thinking is, our self-esteem has been destroyed. The other thing in neuroscience that they talk about a bit is that process has caused a rewiring in our brain and new neural pathways that have created that, that and solidified that thinking. But the thing is that we can actually change some of that.
Yeah.
And we can create new neural pathways. And so if we're going or trying to do that, then usually it can take 6 to 8 weeks in adults. It's faster if it's done through something we love.
Mm-hmm.
But like one of the exercises I remember is like when we are distressed or when we are upset about things, our breathing changes, it becomes very shallow, right?
Yeah.
And if we have histories of trauma, we tend to be shallow breathers. So usually I say, look, here's what I need you to do. And this is just that process of creating neural pathways around our breathing, is that I want you to just count your breaths in a minute. And what you should expect to count is about, for good, deep, proper breathing from the belly, 10 to 12 breaths. One breath is a breath in and out, that's one breath, in 1 minute. Now, people with histories of traumas, like that's pretty extensive, or are still quite traumatized, say, from the relationship, might be breathing sort of 15 and up. Now, they're breathing way too shallow, and
Yeah.
that actually increases your anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
or your sense of feeling anxious. Slow breathing, and it's the breath out that is actually needs to be a longer breath out than the breath in,
Mm-hmm.
needs to be, that's the one that helps, and it slows our heart rate, and it actually can help reduce anxiety, and that's why they do the breathing exercises. But if we're trying to retrain our daily breath, what I used to say is, what I want you to do is every day, and you can do it more than one time a day, but do it every day at set times of the day, so your brain is trained into getting into this exercise. I want you to just sit there for a few minutes and just focus on your breathing and just practice with the deep breaths so that you're down to 10 to 12 in a minute, and you do this every day for at least 6 to 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to retrain how you breathe.
Yeah.
And because that, our breathing is really important. And if we have had these histories, or if we are traumatized, we've got to get out of that shallow breathing, because the deep breath and the slowed down heart rate helps again with the bursts of oxytocin.
Yes.
And then what we want to do is increase our capacity to connect with people, and that's the hormone that's going to do it.
Yes, fantastic. And also the great thing about our breath is that we have it with us every second of the day. So it
Yeah.
is something that we can use. And just a few things too that I'd like to point out, because you mentioned how you can go to different people for different things. And I think that was really a good bit of advice, because oftentimes we normally choose one person and we lay everything on them.
Yeah.
And of course, they burn out as well. So just the thought that I can go to this person for this particular thing and somebody else, it really makes it much easier for them and for you too. So, and it's also recognizing what you actually need rather than just being overwhelmed. You can actually say to yourself, well, what do I need?
Yeah.
So that was a really great piece of advice. And also, I think it's important to be mindful too that if this conversation has triggered anything, perhaps, there's Lifeline or Beyond Blue. I don't know if you have any other suggestions, Joan. People to
Well,
contact and ring if they need to.
yeah, I think if you do feel distressed or triggered by anything, contacting those services, yeah, absolutely. Or if you have somebody that you trust,
Mm-hmm.
and that can give you and meet one of those needs, then please always reach out and try to connect, because honestly, we the best form of healing is healing through relationships. It's just that we have to make sure that those relationships moving forward are safe ones.
Yes. And it's really interesting, isn't it, in terms of divorce and separation, that the very thing that is causing us pain and trauma is the very thing that's going to heal us. It's, yeah, very
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, I heard an analogy once, and it was a researcher in this space, and he used the analogy of, if you think about it, because this is all, a lot of our reactions are controlled by our nervous system, and because trauma is so physical. So the analogy was, if you imagine that your body is a plane, and if your experiences of other human beings have been awful throughout your development and your growth in your life, and they've been traumatic, then what happens, if you think about your body as the plane, your nervous system is, say, border protection. And so border protection's job is to keep the terrorist off the plane.
Right.
And so for some people, when other human beings are the cause of their pain, the difficulty lies in when people get too close, or your attachments as you move forward and you're trying to connect with other people, your nervous system can sometimes activate when people are getting too close.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that those people have done the wrong thing or anything like that, or that you've done the wrong thing. It's just how we've been reprogrammed because of these experiences that we've gone through. And sometimes we have a big reaction, and it's not because that person's done something wrong, and it's important to remember that, but because it's just triggered something in us because of these prior events in our lives.
Yeah.
And so that awareness of that sometimes is helpful, because even if we are triggered, at least bad things happen, and we can be triggered, and we can have a big reaction or conflict with someone. It's not the conflict that's it's how we repair it afterwards that is important. So moving forward with those relationships, sometimes we might get triggered by the people that are supporting and helping us, because of that experience. It's not anybody's fault, including yours. It's just that programming. But when we identify it and realize it, we can respond to it, and we can then work on that repair. And that's where the growth in those relationships actually really takes place and develops and deepens.
Yes.
And a lot of healing can actually take place in that. So, I just sort of thought of that at the end, because honestly, that's been my experience a lot of time when I've worked with people, and you do get too close, and these people have had these experiences, and then they feel terrible, and they back off, and they run away because of that. But if we understand that that's where that's come from, it's easier then to step forward and say, look, I don't know what happened then. I'm so sorry. What can we do to repair this?
Yes. That's such good advice as well, because I think even sometimes people going through this wouldn't even understand why they're doing those sorts of things, why they're behaving in that way. So to have that understanding, I think, is fantastic. And it's really so important to be gentle with yourself, to have self-compassion, and to really look after yourself, and to connect with your body, and to actually ask yourself what is going on. See if you can get out of that head loop, and just
Yeah.
connect. And as you say, breathing helps in a big way.
Yeah. And if you're in that escalated, triggered state, the way to come down is things like breath and slowing things down, and connection, and doing something that's soothing to us and can soothe. But if we're in that really low depressed state where you can't even get out of bed, often the best way forward is movement, and being able to move and to gently rise, not fast, intense movement, but being able to take ourselves out of that by that gentle sort of response to coming out, and spacing out that movement to trigger other aspects of our nervous system, because a lot of healing with trauma is more physical than narrative or story or whatever, because a
Yeah.
lot of people's trauma, they don't always have the story either.
Yes.
We often have this assumption, there are lots of people out there that, might have experienced trauma at the age of, say, 2 or 3, and they don't have the memory.
Yes.
And the memory may never arrive, because this is a lot before real memory is formed. And so when we don't have those memories, but we have these reactions, there might have been things that have happened in our early life that we just don't know about and may never know about. But but our body is reacting, and so that's why a lot of the physical stuff is often uh, helps with our regulation and our ability to sort of calm ourselves down. So there's things like getting out in nature, they say, is actually a calming experience. Animals are calming. I have 3 dogs, so, but there's physical activity is good. Getting involved in sensory activities. If you love to cook, if you love to garden, those things that actually bring out the sensory stuff, because that's where all that memory is. It's all sensory. So the soothing stuff sort of needs to sit in that space when we are in that really highly distressed types of things, and pay attention to your body. So if you're upset about something, and sometimes when I'm upset, I notice I have a dry mouth. So paying attention to that and noticing that and going and having a drink, that in and of itself can be soothing.
Yes.
Or noticing that I'm hungry, or we've all heard the term hangry, or that I'm cold, or that I'm hot, or whatever. Sometimes just dealing with those really basic things, and just being able to pay attention and notice those sorts of things is really helpful as well. And then being able to respond to it. But that's knowing that when your body is in that state. And that's why I was sort of talking earlier about, sort of knowing our body.
Yes, no, that's great. And I think also it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be very simple. And going back to mindfulness, one of the interviews that I had, they talked about getting in the shower each morning and just soaping down and just really feeling that experience. And I thought that's great, because we think of mindfulness as a chore that we have to do, but if you imagine that it can actually be pleasant and pleasurable, then it's wonderful.
Yeah, it can be any activity, really. It can be sort of, sitting there and savoring your favorite food.
Yes.
Like it's paying attention to the moment and being in the present, rather than, when we're dragged back through our trees into, we're sitting in the past, and those emotions are the past emotions. And so mindfulness is about keeping us in the now and in the present, and realizing that we are safe, because every time we're triggered by something, whether it's trauma or whether it's just a distressing experience, we're going back, and we're going back to the emotion of that as well, with the same level of intensity. Because the thing about emotion or pain, emotional pain, is that physical pain and emotional pain, though they sit sort of in the same area of the brain, the intensity of emotional pain, when it's triggered in just the right way, never decreases. So you can still feel, if it's triggered the right way, 60 years later, that level of intensity of pain. With physical pain, that's not the case. But with, the memory of pain, even that, but that in that emotional pain, that intensity can be triggered at the same level we first experienced it, if it's the right trigger.
Yes. And if you feel that your body is starting to get a bit out of control or something like that, do you think just saying the words, "I am safe," would be useful?
Yes, or things, or sometimes, like I've been in that state. I'm sure we all have, over different things in our lives. We've all had different experiences. Um, I do things, if I'm starting to panic over something, I'll self-talk myself. You've been through this before, you got through it.
Yes.
Or when I'm starting to feel overwhelmed by so many things at once, and I go, you know what's the most important? Let's start there. Everything else can wait. We'll just start with the most important.
Yes.
Other things I've said to myself might have been, is this going to matter in 5 years? Like, is this going to be that important? And sometimes it is. You're safe, you're okay. You're safe, you're okay. And just repeating that. So it's like, and again, it's like there is no one thing. It's about finding the right thing for that moment,
Yes.
in terms of what we need. you know. So self-talk's a good one, because I mean, self-talk can be used in that rewiring too for people with, you know, that's why they'd say to you, stand in front of the mirror and say affirmations to yourself. Like, that's a rewiring exercise. It's just that you have to do it at the same time of day. You have to do, you know, and you have to do it over this extended period of time.
Right.
Some people think, oh, this is stupid, why am I doing that? But you know, like, it's the same sort of activity there.
Right, thank you. Look, Joan, that was just wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure that people got a great deal out of that. So if people want to find out more about you, how do they do that?
God, I don't know.
I know you're
um,
on LinkedIn.
I'm on LinkedIn. Yes, I am on LinkedIn. Yeah, look, if people want to contact me through that, that's fine. If they have questions or anything like that, I'm not a business owner or anything like that. I'm just somebody that's worked in my community for 23 years in this area and has a slight obsession with trauma. And I believe quite strongly that you know, for our communities and everything like that, one of the most important things is being compassionate and being kind. But I'm happy to share information or with people, because I think often most people don't have these tools or
Yeah,
don't sort of understand the why of it, and sometimes that is helpful. And you know, I think if we're ever going to improve our communities, the more people understand this, the better. So I just, you know, I'm pretty open about sharing that sort of thing. So if anyone wants, yeah, that's no problem.
beautiful. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you coming on to this summit and sharing your wisdom and your experience. So thank you.
No worries. Thank you.